Coincidence and its natural reasons. Coincidence doesn't come from nowhere. It always has its underlying, lawful cause. Topics covered: ignorance, objective coincidence, information, computers, determinism, mysticism, meditation. I've noticed, said CP, the conversation partner I was speaking with, that the word coincidence is often used. Coincidence is a synonym for ignorance, I explained. When someone speaks of coincidence, they mean something that occurred unexpectedly, something that could not be calculated or predicted. If you look closely, you'll notice that the word coincidence is often used in the sense of without cause or reason, or, even more drastically, something that happened out of nowhere. These examples are frequently used to argue for the aforementioned coincidence occurrence out of nowhere. And further, arguments, we speak of coincidence when no causal explanation can be found for a single event or the coincidence of several events. Radioactive decay is not a deterministic process. The decay time of an individual atomic nucleus is completely random. Coincidence governs the microcosm. In the atomic world, individual events are fundamentally no longer precisely predictable, no longer deterministic. My comment: many statements can be found in the same or similar form, along the lines of, no causal explanation can be found. Hardly anyone considers that every substance is governed by precise laws that lead to the respective, random, events, and these laws are, of course, causal. Why not? Because it's impossible for humans to know all the laws in every substance. If something exists, it is always simultaneously substance and law. Identical substances under identical circumstances always produce identical results. The reason for this is that everything is subject to unalterable laws. If substances or circumstances are changed, then other laws also come into play. To nevertheless make statements about events, one prefers to resort to causal reasons, by which one doesn't mean laws, but rather components, and says that if none are found, these events are random. Causal reason is considered proof of an unbroken chain of components that produced something, or the ability to predict a result using these components. This type of consideration originated in the macroscopic area and was successful. And, unfortunately, it was transferred to the microscopic space after the discoveries, especially regarding quantum physics. However, due to complicated or impossible measurements, causal chains were ultimately difficult or impossible to prove. And that's why the word coincidence was often used here. When measuring in quantum physics, it is important not to cause the measuring technique to have an effect on the particle being measured. Through increasingly refined methods, an interaction-free measurement is now possible. As stated above, laws apply to all substances, whether in the macro or microscopic realm. The question, therefore, is, to prove determinism, is it absolutely necessary to depict causal chains of elements? Or isn't it much more accurate to demonstrate the laws that govern substances, or rather, to assume that everything is shaped by them? Because everything aims to form a structure according to these laws. There are two viewpoints here. Something arises from nothing. Everything has its reason. I am convinced of the latter. Ignorance. CP nodded. So, the word is basically used when there is ignorance of natural processes. That's right. One can generally add to coincidence, because I don't know the natural processes that led to it. Because all substances in the universe, which of course includes quanta, behave according to laws. Therefore, everything is also deterministic. However, if one were to try to prove determinism for predictions using chains of causality, one would quickly fail, because the sheer number of substances and laws exceeds all human dimensions. Thus, all substances behave according to laws. An identical substance under an identical environment always produces an identical result. The fact that one might encounter difficulties in creating particles identical to an environment in the quantum world does not refute this thesis. If one modifies it to the form, identical substances under identical conditions always produce the same result, then one could circumvent these difficulties. Could it be reduced to this guiding principle? CP asked. Coincidence is a synonym for not knowing about lawful processes that one doesn't fully understand. I can agree with that immediately, I nodded. Objective coincidence. But there are quantum physicists who speak of objective coincidence, CP interjected. They mean that if you conduct an experiment in the world of elementary particles in which two identical particles, occurring at different times and under identical circumstances, do not produce identical results, then there are no hidden variables that could be said to have caused this unequal outcome. As we've already established, coincidence is synonymous with not knowing. You simply cannot know how many local or non-local influences acted upon the respective particles temporarily present here, each of which has its own inherent laws. A law also means that particles always exhibit identical results through identical interactions. Because, and this is proof that everything in quantum systems also follows laws, statistical probability theory allows for very precise predictions in quantum systems. This would be impossible if there were no laws governing them. Humans, when they want to know something precisely, also rely on measurements in quantum systems. If this is not possible, for example, due to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, then the only remaining option is mathematical description. With this, however, very precise statements can be made about quantum systems. This is, of course, only possible because, as everywhere, everything here follows laws. Regarding objective randomness, objective means that something is as it is at the moment, without human influence, such as measurement or perspective. If randomness comes into play here, that is, something that has befallen the lawful object, for example, through its internal configuration, then this is, so to speak, objective randomness. An objective event always has a lawful cause. If people say that something is impossible for them to measure, this does not prove that no laws apply. This also applies to the objection that statistical probability doesn't include everything 100% of the time and is therefore proof that not everything happens according to laws. A really weak argument, CP nodded. One more brief remark on Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Wikipedia. When measuring the x-coordinate and x-momentum, their order must be determined, and in precisely these cases, the second measurement modifies the state produced by the first measurement once again. Therefore, a subsequent repetition of the first measurement would also yield a different result. Thus, it is possible that two observables, if they act on a state in different orders, can produce different final states. Information, and, there are quantum physicists who claim that quanta need information to know what to do. But inorganic matter doesn't need information. Substances behave naturally according to the laws of physics. Inorganic matter only needs information if humans want to achieve a goal with it, not inherently, because it behaves according to substances and laws anyway, and it doesn't care what happens. Incidentally, if you provide information, and this information has an effect, then you are changing a lawful process. In contrast, it's different with living beings. Since they don't know the future but have to choose the right paths to their goals, they need information, for example, to sustain their lives. As mentioned, this is no more the case with inorganic matter in the macro world than it is in the micro world, for example, with quanta, molecules, and atoms. It doesn't matter what happens next. So, anyone who claims that inorganic matter needs information is mistaken. Because, as just said, inorganic substances don't need information, they consist of laws. If you want to recognize a substance, you would have to perceive the laws it follows. Let me repeat, said CP. So, you can say that individual elementary particles don't carry any information. Therefore, they can't give us any either. They operate according to the laws of their entirety, with their environment. Therefore, you can say that identical elementary particles in identical environments always produce identical results. If this doesn't happen, then either the elementary particles or the environment weren't identical. Exactly, I nodded. Computers, something just occurred to me, CP muses, computers need information too. That's right, computers are machines that need information from human input to know which data to process and how. What's the difference between a brain and a computer? One example of this is CAPTCHA, an online test that reveals whether an application is being used by a human or a computer. It consists of graphically represented, distorted letters and numbers that users must recognize and enter into a query window during the registration process. Humans, with their innate creativity, the ability to draw conclusions from similarities, can accomplish this in a matter of moments. A computer fails at this task because it calculates rigidly and cannot accurately interpret the infinitely ambiguous parts of images. The computer has a binary structure. It operates on the basis of zeros and ones. It has a rigid, computational framework. The brain, however, has a creative structure that is open to any similarity. Creativity means connecting similarities that occur in a wide variety of areas. Everything has some characteristic similar to something else. For example, color, size, temporal proximity, geometric shape, faces, and so on. This list could go on and on. Answer: there are no limits to creativity. Therefore, it is also especially creative in sleep, because here the midpoints cannot interfere. Incidentally, these similarities are also the reason for confusion, as well as a source of brilliant insights. So, creativity isn't anything supernatural, CP interjected, but rather something that arises within people because of goals. Right, I nodded. Furthermore, the brain is constantly creative. It makes what we perceive fluid, that is, it shapes everything into a good form that can be easily handled. The goal here is not to analyze the situation down to the smallest detail, but to present it in such a way that one can quickly form an image in order to, and this is the real reason, survive better. This also includes the creativity of the moment. This becomes particularly active in conversations or when one engages more intensively with something. It means that something new suddenly arises spontaneously within oneself that fits well with the topic. So, the brain generally simplifies, CP concluded. That's right, because no living being could navigate and survive in the world if it constantly and at all times dissected every situation into its individual components. That's also why people experience the world holistically. Determinism. What about determinism? CP asked, intrigued. There are two opposing worldviews, determinism and indeterminism, as mentioned earlier. Determinism states that everything in the universe has its reasons, that it follows laws. The other group believes that much happens without cause. Here are some examples. Events happen without a cause, they are said to come from nothing, that free will exists, that a metaphysical power is behind it. As I said, I belong to the first group. Because I believe that nothing can come from nothing. You mean, ultimately, that everything in the universe follows laws and that every event is therefore predetermined. For me, that's clear. It's also said that, for example, you can't predict the decay of a radioactive atom, that is, exactly when it will happen, CP continued. We've already discussed this. It's precisely determined by the inherent laws and the local or non-local environment. A substance, in this case an atom, is something that is constantly in motion internally. Accordingly, the laws are always changing because the structure changes, and every structural change gives rise to different laws. It follows from this that the decay of a radioactive atom cannot be predicted exactly, because we don't know all the internal processes down to the smallest detail. And a substance in the quantum world, which operates according to laws, is hardly ever isolated. It always has a local and non-local environment that, according to laws, albeit in a modified form, co-determines its course. Often, it's not enough to consider only the particle itself. One has to take the environment into account, which makes understanding it extremely difficult. You're saying, if you define something, you exclude something else. Yes, boundaries are always drawn arbitrarily. It's human nature. We have to deal with substances we can calculate in order to achieve a result, for example, to be able to act. What are the causes? Where exactly do these boundaries that people draw come from? From the midpoint mechanics. The midpoint selects what fits the goal. So, boundaries are drawn by the midpoint. If we were to include all irrelevant facts in our world, we would be incapable of action. That's probably impossible anyway, because the quantity would be immeasurably large, CP concluded. Yes, and that's why drawing boundaries makes sense in the macroscopic realm of action. Mysticism. Since we also mentioned mysticism, CP interjected, how could one explain phenomena like chi? Through desire and belief in it. For example, learning a worldview. Here, the effect of the midpoint principle is clearly visible. You set a goal. Through concentration and practice, a neural network develops that gets ever closer to this goal, be it inner peace, contemplation with a higher being, martial arts, etc., until it reaches perfection. The goal subtly structures the individual down to the smallest detail. Naturally, other goals lose more and more importance during practice and therefore have less of an impact on the process. Chi, therefore, is not something supernatural, but can be cultivated and learned through a midpoint, which usually takes a considerable amount of time. This attitude will have an impact on everyday life because you will then perceive unwanted thoughts and feelings, but react to them less. And here, too, you can achieve the goals that are active within you with more energy. This is especially true for breath yoga. It has a holistic effect on the general psyche of a person via neural networks. Similarly, when people want to believe in higher beings, such as a god, the focus of contemplation also includes the primal structures, in which the being of God originated. It also allows for the experiences that the brain conjured up for the child during the magical phase. There are many people who have never even heard of the magical phase. This means that the experiences, images, and feelings they went through during childhood usually continue to work within him completely unconsciously. At least I'm aware of it, CP nodded. Meditations. And what about mindfulness exercises? He inquired further. In mindfulness, being centered, and doing what you do, it's about staying present with what you are doing and weakening or even eliminating resentment toward the past or fear about the future that tries to manifest in your thoughts, especially by becoming fully absorbed in the present moment. This happens through this midpoint, similar to chi, which draws attention away from everything else that doesn't belong. None of this is mystical or supernatural, even if those who practice it like to think so. Of course, thoughts and feelings will always arise. In mindfulness exercises, you should acknowledge these when they are very strong, but not engage with them. Instead, stay with where you are. If you were to engage with them, these thoughts or feelings would become midpoints that shape you, consume energy, and thus weaken mindfulness. So, if there's no other way, you should perceive thoughts and feelings, CP summarized, not suppress them, but simply let them arise as they are, and continue your mindfulness of what you are experiencing. That's the central point of this exercise. In this way, you can completely become absorbed in the respective focus, which then, mechanically, ignores the unwanted thoughts and feelings. How do you meditate? CP asked curiously. Let me briefly explain the process of meditation. It begins with the goal of switching off all thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. It is therefore very important to stop the incessant chatter of thoughts. Concentrating on this generates intense neuronal activity in the brain's attention center. This signals the brain to slow down the flow of neuronal information. As a result, an area responsible for our spatial orientation is increasingly cut off from neuronal impulses. If this area lacks the necessary stimuli, it can only create the subjective impression of complete spacelessness, which is interpreted as infinite space and eternity. Another area is responsible for the perception of the boundaries of our body. The total absence of signals in this area means that the perception of oneself becomes limitless. As the meditation deepens, the boundary between the inner and outer worlds blurs, and the feeling arises that one is expanding and merging with the environment. Through concentration, the flood of information from which we derive our orientation diminishes. This also blurs the boundary between oneself and the world, creating a feeling of oneness with the world and of boundlessness. In the deepest meditation, one has the feeling of becoming one with the universe, of dissolving into something much greater. That sounds interesting, CP reflected. Does this process occur automatically in the brain when one is at the center of meditation? Yes, if this goal is effective, and one practices repeatedly. My meditation practice consists of trying to get ever closer to the edge of the universe with each inhale, and then, with each exhale, remaining just below the boundary I have just reached. Since the universe is infinite, I can, of course, never reach its edge. Answer: I can continue this practice indefinitely. On this occasion, a word about displacement. Imagine you focus your attention on something you don't want to acknowledge and engage with it. This makes that something stronger because pressure creates counter-pressure. You then find yourself at its midpoint. Displacement, therefore, achieves the exact opposite of what you want, namely, to push something aside. Therefore, one should simply perceive it, but then not engage with it. However, it is also said that one represses something when something continues to operate unconsciously. This became commonplace because people believed that repression was a conscious act, a conscious choice, and were unaware of the mechanics of focus. As a rule, something is diminished in value by other midpoints, so that it is no longer perceived, but it continues to operate unconsciously, without conscious awareness being able to access the information. Saying, a midpoint or midpoints prevent you from seeing something, is far more accurate than saying, you have repressed something. So, it's always about directing consciousness, or rather, attention, toward a goal, CP continued. The emphasis is on a goal, I underlined. If the goal of forgetting the past were also actively involved, the effect of the first goal would automatically be weakened. For example, one is in the here and now, when perception is focused on the present and this information is sent to the brain. As a result, the brain is less concerned with the past and the future, and primarily focused on the present. So, it really is always about focusing attention on something, which can also be nothing, CP reiterated. Right, it's about letting go. Simply being at the center of the moment. If you get distracted, the phrases, what happened, had to happen as it happened, and what will happen as it must, are particularly effective.